dealt primarily with, sorry, I'm having some technical issues here. The first part dealt primarily with bacteria, and in this presentation we're going to talk about viruses, which we are dealing with a major virus pandemic at this very moment. So this will give you a little bit more background information on what viruses are, how they work. So viruses are what is known as an obligate parasite, which means that they cannot exist on their own. They need to hijack a cell and use that cell's machinery. So they don't have the ability to make ATP, to make proteins, anything like that, because basically all a virus is a couple genes, either DNA or RNA, and then with a covering around it. So they're not even considered to be a cell. They are considered non-cellular because they don't have the normal components of a cell. They do have, some of them have membranes, not even all of them have membranes. If they do have a membrane, they steal it from their host cell. They have genetic material, but they don't have ribosomes, they don't make proteins, they don't do glycolysis, any of that. They need a host cell to do that. I noticed I say all the time. I'm going to try to stop doing that. But they do have genes. Many of them have DNA for their genes, which is what ours are. Some of them have a similar molecule to DNA, which we haven't talked about yet. We will later in the semester, called RNA as their genetic material. So it varies. The coronavirus, which we're dealing with right now, is an RNA virus, so it has RNA as its genetic material. They also have what's known as host specificity, and that means the type of cell they can get into. So sometimes it could be animals, sometimes it could be just mammals, sometimes it could be a bacteria or a plant, sometimes it's a specific type of cell. For the HIV virus, it can only enter into T cells of our immune system. That's their host cell. Because a virus, since it is an obligate parasite, it needs to get into a cell to kind of hijack that cell. So it has to have some mechanism for getting into a cell. So usually there's a certain type of cell, and that it has developed a mechanism for entering into that cell, and that would be its host cell. As I mentioned, viruses are extremely simple. They have a covering, which sometimes is just a protein covering, but sometimes they have something more like a membrane, which is called an envelope. And the membrane, they kind of steal from the host cell. And then inside of the virus is really just their genetic material. There are a few viruses that bring an enzyme with them, but other than that, that's all a virus is a genetic material with a covering. This is just an example of some viruses, and kind of shows here what they look like in a microscope. Not the kind of microscope we have in the lab. They would not be able to show you a virus. They're much smaller than that, but these are scanning electron microscopes. And then these are kind of like schematic pictures. This one is a tobacco mosaic virus, and plants can get viral infections just like animals can. And the tobacco mosaic virus, as you might guess from its name, infects tobacco plants and causes a disease in tobacco plants. And this virus has RNA as its genetic material, and then it's covered in this protein capsid, which is like these little spiky things around it. And that's all it is. This is an adenovirus. Adenovirus, there's a bunch of different strains of adenoviruses. They're one of the types of viruses that cause colds. And it has DNA as its genetic material. And then it's surrounded by this protein shell. And you can see it even kind of looks more geometrical. It's a weird kind of shape. And that's all that it is. This one is influenza virus. And it is similar to the coronavirus in that it has this like spiky things extending from it. And that's why it's called, the coronavirus is called a coronavirus, because that kind of makes it look like the sun with the corona around the sun. But the flu virus has RNA as its genetic material. Then the RNA is covered in this protein coat, which is a capsid. But then around that, there's also a membrane that is hijacked again from the host cell membrane with different proteins stuck in it. And that's what these little spikes are the proteins sticking out of the membrane. So that's the basic structure of the flu virus. This one here is bacteriophage T4. That is actually a virus that infects bacteria. Bacteria are single cells, but they're much bigger still than a virus. And so there are certain viruses that just infect bacteria, so they can get a viral infection also. This one I think is a cool looking one because it kind of looks like a spaceship. And what it does is it lands on the cell. Inside here is its genetic material, and it kind of just injects that down into the cell. This part, the spaceship looking part, actually never enters the cell, just the genetic material does. So when a virus infects a host cell, this is essentially the process it goes through in infecting a cell. First, it has to attach to the cell. And so it has to have some means of getting the cell thinking it's something that's supposed to come in. So sometimes it has a receptor that it hooks onto that it mimics something that normally can enter a cell. So the cell thinks that it's that substance and allows it to enter. So there's a bit of trickery involved in getting in. The other process for getting in is endocytosis. And we talked about that earlier with membranes, of how the membrane like envelops a substance and takes it in. Once inside the cell, basically all a virus does is figure out a way of making more of itself. So then replication occurs. And then once it makes more copies of itself, they're put together with the genetic material, the capsid, and a membrane if it has. So once the virus is able to replicate, make many more copies of it, they're put together, and then it can be released from the cell. So essentially the cell ruptures and hundreds more viruses can be released out of the cell, which can then go and infect other cells. The process we just talked about is called the lytic stage. That's when the virus gets in a cell, makes more copies of itself, and then ruptures the cell and gets released. Some viruses have the ability to go into what's called a latent phase, in which they get into a cell and then they just kind of hide out in the cell. So they're not actively causing an infection, but yet they become part of that cell's DNA and just kind of stay there. And pretty much all viruses do this to some extent, so that they can actually look at your DNA and almost tell which viruses you've ever been infected with. And for example, the HIV virus often can be an extended latent phase where you can test positive for the virus but have no symptoms, and that's because it's in its latent stage where it's kind of hiding out in your DNA. And then for some reason it can go from the latent stage to the lytic stage where it's being replicated, destroying your cells, and that's when you begin to have the symptoms of AIDS. So the latent stage is kind of the virus is, you're still infected with the virus, but it's kind of dormant in your cells and not causing active infection at the time. This is just a picture. So here's the virus, and it enters into the cell. And it doesn't have to be the whole virus. It can either be just the DNA or the whole virus gets into the cell. It goes about making copies of itself, making protein that it needs. If it has the shell that it needs proteins for the capsid, then the parts are all put together and the full virus is then released from the cell. This Another way that viruses are classified besides their shape is the type of genetic material they have. So some viruses have DNA for their genetic material, and some viruses have RNA for their genetic material. Just to give you an example, these are some of the viruses that have DNA for their genetic material: the herpes viruses, all the hepatitis viruses, the pox viruses. They're like chicken pox, smallpox. Those are all DNA. Papilloma, human papilloma virus, that is a DNA virus. Some examples of RNA viruses are HIV is an RNA virus, the flu virus, which I showed you a picture of earlier, rabies, the virus that causes rabies, the virus that causes polio, as well as the coronavirus are all RNA viruses. So just like we did with the bacterial diseases, this slide gives you a breakdown of some common viral diseases to give you a feeling of which things are caused by viruses versus bacteria. I think that's often confusion, is which disorders are viral in origin versus bacterial in origin. And remember that only bacterial infections can be treated with antibiotics. Antibiotics are of no use in treating viral disorders because the mechanism of action of the antibiotics aren't working on a virus. So just like we talked about with bacteria, there are a variety of sexually transmitted diseases that are viral in origin. One that you're particularly familiar with probably is HIV. As a point of clarification, HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. So that's the name of the virus. AIDS is the name of the disorder caused by the virus. AIDS stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome. So you could be HIV positive, but not necessarily have AIDS because you are asymptomatic, which means you don't have any symptoms. Genital warts all warts actually are viral in origin. Genital warts is one type of sexually transmitted disease, as well as genital herpes. But again, all herpes are caused by viruses. The childhood diseases that were common that back in my day everybody got, that we now have vaccines for, that are caused by viruses: mumps, measles, chickenpox, and rubella, or German measles. German measles and rubella are the same thing. And so children now get, at, I think the first one's about a year age, get an MMR vaccine, which stands for measles, mumps, and rubella. So that's measles, mumps, and German measles, and then also get a chickenpox vaccine. And so those prevent those what used to be common childhood disorders, and they have been not quite eliminated, but vastly decreased with the use of vaccines. You probably have heard there's been some problems with measles recurring and even mumps because of some people not getting their children vaccinated, and then that increases the possibility of the disorder reappearing in our society. I'm a strong proponent of vaccines, and they really only work if everyone who can gets them, because otherwise, if there's not about 95% of the population vaccinated, then you're not really preventing the spread of the disease. And there are always certain people who can't get a vaccination for some reason. They have some disorder that their immune system is compromised, and so they can't be vaccinated. So those become particularly vulnerable if the diseases reappear. And although these are considered common childhood disorders, generally not serious, but there can be cases where they are serious and can cause serious illness and perhaps even death. And so they can be eliminated by the vaccine. The chickenpox is a newer one, but still, relatively speaking, I think it appeared about 25, 30 years ago. And so that's one that now is not as common. Some of the respiratory diseases, the cold, the flu, SARS, and now we know COVID-19 are caused by viruses. And we'll talk a little bit more about COVID-19 later. Skin diseases, as I said, all warts are viral. Fever blisters are herpes. Herpes is a very common infection, and it can go into a dormant or a latent stage and then flare up, and that's where you would actually have a fever blister. But if you don't have an active fever blister, once you've had one, you'll always have that infection. So you don't, you always have the virus there, even though it might not be in an active stage right now. Shingles is actually a new form, not a new form, but another expression of the chickenpox virus. There's now a shingles vaccine also. That's relatively newer, but chickenpox, if you had the chickenpox when you were a child, it can reappear later in life as a different type of infection called shingles, where you get some type of rash, but it causes severe nerve pain along the line of where the infection is. And again, it's because that chickenpox virus is kind of still there, and so it reappears as a shingles infection later in life. You can get some GI problems that are virus. Polio is probably the biggest success story, one of the biggest success stories, along with smallpox, of the effective vaccines, because polio is close to being eliminated on the planet, although it's not totally eliminated yet, although it could be, but because of mostly political discord in various areas of the world, there has not been complete availability of vaccines throughout the world. But polio is pretty much gone from this country, Europe, and they generally don't even give the polio vaccine anymore. Rabies is a viral, that's a very serious infection. That is, all mammals can get rabies, so it can be spread through different species. So if you get bit by a dog or a bat or a fox or any of those animals that have a rabies infection, you can get the disease. And it's very important that that is treated immediately, really before you become symptomatic, or otherwise it can be fatal. Where I lived in New Jersey, there was a man who was cleaning out his attic and got bit by a bat. And it turned out, he didn't really think anything of it, but it turned out the bat had rabies. And by the time he put the two together, when he started getting sick, it was too late. He actually passed away from rabies from the bat biting him. And then some of the other ones, smallpox. Smallpox has pretty much, I wouldn't say pretty much, it has been eliminated from the planet through the vaccination procedure. They generally don't even give smallpox vaccinations, although I think sometimes military that are going overseas might still be given a smallpox vaccination. Hemorrhagic fevers are like Ebola. Some types of cancer are due to viruses. All the types of hepatitis are viruses. Mono, conjunctivitis are some of the other things you may have heard of that are all viral in origin. I was going to just talk about a few of them in a little bit more detail. This is the HIV virus, which causes AIDS, and it's an extremely deadly virus, although treatment of it has improved in recent years. It is a blood-borne virus in that the virus, when you get infected with it, its host cell is one of your white blood cells called a T cell. And so in order to get the virus, you have to essentially be exposed to another individual's T cells through blood exposure. So it's a blood-to-blood transfer primarily. So that can be through blood transfusions, through sexually transmitted, that it can be transmitted from one person to another person. The virus is an RNA virus. And so this kind of red thing here is its RNA. And then this is the protein capsid that encircles the RNA. And then it does have an envelope surrounding it that it takes from the host cell, but then inserts these proteins in the membrane. And so it kind of has that spiky appearance too. And it's these proteins sticking out that enable it to enter into the T cells because they're recognized as a receptor. And so the virus gains entry that way. This virus is somewhat unique in that it brings with it, besides its RNA, it brings an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. And what that enzyme does is once it gets in the host cell, it takes the RNA that it brought with it and converts it into DNA. And then that DNA can become part of the host cell's DNA. So that's how it can get permanently inserted into your DNA once you get infected with HIV. And so that ability to take RNA and convert it back to DNA, only a small number of viruses have that capability, and the HIV virus is one of them. And this is just showing, this is a little bit hard to see maybe, but here is the HIV virus attaching to a receptor on the T cell membrane, and that gets it into the membrane, into the cell. And then its RNA is released. It uses it to make a copy into DNA, which then becomes part of the host cell DNA. And when it's in its lytic stage, that is when it's rapidly making more copies of itself, it's making more of its RNA, that enzyme, the capsid, and then it gets pinched off and released from the cell. When it does that, it destroys the T cell. And one of the indicators of how severe HIV infection is the number of functioning T cells a person has left, because as it spreads, it destroys more and more of the individual's T cells, and eventually gets to the point where there are no more or a very low number of functioning T cells. So that most of the symptoms of AIDS are due to the fact that the immune system of the individual infected with HIV is no longer functioning, so that the ability to fight off other infections and other type of cancer-causing changes is wiped out. And so infections that a healthy person would be able to fight off can be fatal in a person with AIDS because their immune system is no longer functioning. And this is just an indication of some of the disorders that are common amongst individuals with AIDS that are due to these infections being much more severe than what they should be in an individual. Excuse me. Another virus that you heard a lot about is Ebola, and that tends to have breakouts sporadically. Ebola is what's called a hemorrhagic, which means it causes you to hemorrhage, which means it causes you to bleed. It's often fatal. It infects primates, which would be us, and chimpanzees, gorillas, monkeys can get Ebola. And again, it is also a blood infection, so it's spread blood to blood, excuse me, from individual to individual. And so any kind of contaminated needle, etc., can spread the infection. Originally, when it first appeared, most of the outbreaks were in small, isolated areas that were a little bit easier to quarantine. And because of its high fatality rate, it kind of destroys itself after a while. But the last infection a number of years ago did hit some big cities, and there were people traveling on airplanes, and so there was more of a concern of it becoming a more widespread infection. And then this is our new coronavirus. And coronavirus is actually a type of viruses, but this is called a novel coronavirus, which means it's a new one. And it is an RNA virus. And so it's composed of RNA, which is this kind of squiggly thing. And then this is the envelope around it with the little spiky protein sticking out. And that's why it's called a coronavirus, because that kind of gives this appearance of like this corona around the virus. And so it gets inside of your cell and then uses your cell to make more copies of itself, which are then released by exocytosis from the cell. Some of the symptoms, as you probably have heard, are usually starts with a high fever and a cough that can get very severe. And one of the most notable things seem to be difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, tiredness. Sometimes there's vomiting. There was just an article in the paper yesterday that a group of doctors who had been treating COVID infections in Europe felt that one of the very early signs was a loss of taste sensation and smell, so that if like you're cooking onions and you're not able to smell them too well, that's one of the early signs of a COVID-19 infection. COVID-19 is the name of the disorder. I think that stands for coronavirus disease. And it's the 19th one. I'm not sure where the 19 came from.